Hello, everyone. This is Jawad, your host of Kingdom of Dreams podcast. Welcome back to another episode. A couple of things before we start the podcast. We have a new logo, which you probably have started seeing on the header of Spotify, uh, Apple, as well as YouTube. You'll start seeing an introduction in the next week or two. We're working on the animation, as well as a new set of new thumbs and a bunch of other stuff. Today's episode is one of the episodes that we did way back in the beginning of the podcast. And for some reason, which I can't recall what it was, we took it offline, but I just want to bring it back up. It was where we interviewed James Mottram, the author of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, The Ultimate Visual History. You might not see the quality of the video and audio up to par. If there's somebody that you want to be a guest on our podcast, any name, any movie, any series from the past, present, or upcoming, drop us a comment below. And we're always looking for an extra hand to become part of this amazing community and help out. Without further ado, here's my conversation with James Mottram.
When Jurassic Park came out, I didn't get to see it in theaters, just like you.
Right.
But I read articles, I saw Entertainment Tonight, I saw so many things, and I became obsessed over it. And I waited for 16 months before it came out to VHS. And in that time, I became like a diehard Spielberg fan, and I knew I wanted to, be a filmmaker with my life. So and The Lost World, I wasn't too crazy about it, but the experience I had watching it was phenomenal because there was a local movie theater that opened. They had like 25 screens, and it opened the day the movie opened. So they dedicated all the movie theaters to to The Lost World, and it was just like shoulder to shoulder.
I would agree with that, and that's why I said to you earlier, it sort of took me by surprise, because I mean, like I said, I mentioned Indiana Jones. I'm also a huge Star Wars fan. Obviously, I grew up in that era, so you're aware of those fan bases. Yeah. And if you think about it, Jurassic's really only had 6 movies. Star Wars has had multiple films. Okay, Indiana Jones hasn't, but really, for a long time, it was just the 3 movies, and of course, then there was this huge gap until Jurassic World. Of course, they struggled to try and get a 4th movie made for a long time.
Yeah.
And yet, I'm not saying it was an underground fan base. It certainly wasn't. But I guess they didn't have a lot to feed them over those intervening years. There were some comics and there were some video games, and which, as you probably know if you've seen the book, we go into a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I think what was interesting with Jurassic World is that obviously a lot of the people who took their kids, they were probably young when the first one came out. So it sort of, and in the end, it's pretty simple why the Jurassic films are so successful, apart from being well made, of course. Yeah. Kids love dinosaurs. There is absolutely, and that's big kids as well, obviously. And there's something I spent a long time thinking about this and asking people about this, how much of it has gone into the book. I can't really remember now, but it's really about the sort of primal attraction of these creatures, of course, that lived on our planet so many, millions of years ago. And they're fascinating to kids. And of course, there's other dinosaur films out there, but there's nothing like these movies. I mean, obviously, the first one just set the bar so high, probably to the detriment of the rest of the franchise. It's never gonna beat. Even Star Wars was probably beaten by The Empire Strikes Back. That's debatable, of course. Yeah. But
I think a lot of it had to do with the novelty of seeing dinosaurs the way they were shown, and of course the evolution of special effects. Like that film pretty much changed Hollywood when it came to effects. Going to your book, how does it work in terms of when you're approached by a publisher, or do you show interest? Like, what's the process of that? And if you can.
Well, this one, if I'm being, sort of straight up, I'd literally just finished the Tenet book. So we're talking about March, April 2020. And of course, you probably know what happened then around the world. The pandemic happened, certainly in the UK, but in many other places, cinemas shut. So my day-to-day job was suddenly sort of torpedoed because there was nothing coming out new apart from on streaming platforms. So I had very little to write about. So I said to my editor, well, you know, now if you've got any other ideas, now's the time. And he was like, how do you feel about doing Jurassic? And I think they must have already been in conversations with Universal and Amblin, because of course these books are officially licensed by the studios. And of course I jumped at it. And I sort of started straight away. I mean, it was a very strange time for everyone, of course. And I was just sort of sitting at home. It was like a perfect time to do research. You could sit and read the Michael Crichton books. You could, go back through the films. And of course, in terms of contacting people who were in those films, a lot of people were, some were working in some capacity, but a lot of them were just at home, not doing very much. They were sort of, so I'm not saying it was necessarily that easy to get them. You've always got hoops to go through before you get to these people, but their schedules weren't quite as crazy as perhaps they might be. And it sort of started from there. So I was, basically researching the Jurassic Park book and the Jurassic World book sort of simultaneously, because I was just trying to reach out to people, from both franchises at the same time. But the Park book took precedence because that had to come out first.
So you were given the go-ahead for both books simultaneously?
Well, truth be told, originally, say for example, the Die Hard book that I mentioned, that's one book that covers all 5 Die Hard movies. So the original plan was to cover all 6 movies in one book.
Sure.
And then I believe, it's not fully been confirmed to me, but from what I was told, Colin Trevorrow suggested, well, why not split it into 2 books? Which logically makes perfect sense, because he's obviously been, intricately involved in the more recent franchise. And obviously Spielberg was sort of, or a huge part of the first franchise. So it made complete sense to split them up into 2 books. And to be honest, it would have been a giant book, or it would have been a book that the fans would not have been satisfied with if we'd done just one, because you wouldn't have had room to cover the movies in the depth that they deserve.
I agree 100%. And even when I was going through the Jurassic World book, because it's split into 3 parts, just like the first one, I was, when I was going through it, I'm like, should each film have its own book, not each series, right? I mean, because and I know this because, I mean, you're a journalist, and I make documentaries, feature documentaries for a living, and I know that you interview so many people, and there's so many different ways to tackle it, but to concise it all together, it's the person who's writing it or editing it knows that how much work goes through it. So I'm glad that you guys split it into 2 books, and I do feel that they're different series altogether. Because
that's the other thing. That's completely right. They do have different feels about them, and it just made even the design of the 2 books, although they're obviously exactly the same size and they have similar designs. I think the second one, they've got more of the kind of metallic blue-gray coloring through the book, which obviously reflects the
branding of the film.
Exactly, the branding of the film. So, it made complete sense to do that. And you're right, on some level, I've seen some fans online who've seen the books who were, they wanted more. And I totally don't blame them for that, because they want every last Jurassic detail you can squeeze out, but there just isn't the room for that in these books. And I think you're right. Realistically, those books, you could easily do a book on each film, quite easily. I mean, the Dominion one, it's a different experience, because, for example, I had to finish it before the movie came out. So if you notice all the other films, you have a last couple of pages where I'm talking about the release and the box office and how it was received. Of course, I couldn't do that for Dominion, because I had to finish before, but just because of the publishing schedules are kind of crazy and needs to be done quite a way before the film came out.
Right.
And even now it's coming out in October. We didn't hit that deadline because there were lots of different delays. The pandemic really sort of made things very difficult. But I would love to. I overwrote in both cases. Both books were longer. The manuscript I handed in, and of course, then you have the very painful process of wrangling with the editor about what gets cut, and he cuts some of your favorite bits, and you're absolutely gutted. But in the end, his argument, and it's a very true, it's what we try and do with these books, is you're telling a story, i.e. the story of how these movies got made. And so you might have the best bit of trivia in the world, but if it doesn't really fit in the story, it goes.
100%. And I mean, that's why you have an editor, right? Because we as writers or filmmakers, we become so attached to these stories because we're so involved in them that it's hard to see, past them. Going back to what we're talking about, the splitting of the book, what I really loved about the second book, which ties into the first book, I loved how it started off as a fan-based, introduction, like Ian Bryce Howard, Kathleen Kennedy. So everybody who sort of talks about their character, the directors and everybody, there's a connection to the first three films. And I find I haven't thoroughly gone through the first three books, the three films, but this is more of a fandom book to me, because it kind of gives you that nostalgic, point of view that, when we were making this 30 years ago, this is how it's sort of set up. So that I really enjoyed it. One of my questions is, what was, you spoke to how many people? I'm imagining over 50, 60 people for each book.
Probably about it's about 100 across both books. So yeah, you're right, about 50 each, roughly speaking.
And most of the interviews, I'm assuming, because it was during COVID, you did it over Zoom or
yeah, it was I think a lot of them were over the phone. Actually, it was some were Zoom, some were on the phone. It was a little bit before Zoom became this kind of ubiquitous thing, but yeah, I think we did do some on Zoom.
And I'm assuming in writing these kind of books, COVID or no COVID, most of the time, if at all, it's over the phone, just because everybody's schedule is so tight and busy, right?
Well, and also, of course, I'm based in London, so it's not that easy to, jump on an airplane. And as much as I'd love to have some FaceTime with Mr. Spielberg, it was all had to be done on the phone. But that's fine. It works fine for these purposes, I think. Sure. The difficult thing is getting through their people and getting them to agree. It's kind of a snowball effect, though. The sort of early question you get from sort of publicists is, who else is involved? They want to know that they're putting their client up for something that's obviously official, and it is, because they get asked to do these kind of interviews a lot, I think, especially about Jurassic, because obviously it's so popular. And yeah, I mean, initially, I wouldn't say it was a struggle, but some interviews took a long time to set up, because partly also another reason being they were filming Dominion at this time. So you had to wait. Laura Dern, for example, her publicist was great, but it took a long time to get her because she was on Dominion, which is totally fine. I am not their priority when they're making the sixth Jurassic Park film, or Jurassic World film, as it were.
And who was the first person you interviewed?
That is a very good question. I think it was Dennis Muren, because we had, well, I can tell you that very early on I spoke to Dennis Muren and Phil Tippett, because my editor had sort of worked with them before, so we had sort of personal contacts that we could sort of directly go to them. So they were very early in the process, which was good. I mean, you have to start somewhere. And Rick Carter, I got quite early on. He was absolutely fantastic. He was so nice and gave me so much detail. And strangely, with the two Christopher Nolan books I did, in both cases, they wanted me, as sort of Nolan's, team, let's say, wanted me to speak to Nathan Crowley, the production designer who worked on both films, first, because Nathan works with Nolan so intimately early on in the process. So production designers are always great to speak to early on, because they know so much about the process. So yeah, Rick Carter was quite early on, but yeah, the special effects guys were or the visual effects guys were sort of, pretty early in the process. But then that was sort of interesting, because I almost, perhaps to my detriment, relied on what those two said, Phil and Dennis, for a long time, and of course they're hugely important in the evolution of Jurassic Park. But then you come to realize over time that there were so many other people. Like you said, it was groundbreaking special effects, but it wasn't just those two involved. There were so many others, and it's a peeling back of the layers as you gradually start to speak to other people, and you realize that there's usually more than one side to the story. I don't know if you've seen this. I think it's called Light and Magic. It's on Disney Plus. So it's
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it yet. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Well, it's about obviously the evolution of ILM, and there is a chapter devoted to Jurassic, and it's got a lot of the same people in it that I interviewed. And I think in that case they do sort of tell different sides of the story, which is really interesting. And that's obviously what we tried to do in the book as well. Well, certainly the first one, because that's where those effects, that's where digital visual effects came into being. Well, they had been around before, but not in the degree that you got in Jurassic Park. So yeah, they were my early ones. In terms of the Jurassic World franchise, I can't remember who the first person I spoke to out of that was. I think Daniel Orlandi, who was the costume designer on Jurassic World, he was quite early on. Pat Crowley, who's the producer of all of those recent films, he was pretty early on. He was amazing. He was so helpful. Again, he was, in England in the midst of making Dominion while they were the first major movie back after COVID. And yet he found time to speak. And, so many people were so generous with their time.
You mentioned Jurassic Park. I guess we can sway away the Jurassic Park trilogy for now. One thing with Jurassic World, or maybe this is my ignorance because I'm more attached to the Jurassic Park trilogy, just growing up, as opposed to Jurassic World. There was because that film was so groundbreaking, there's a Making of Jurassic Park book that came out in the 90s. There's so many documentaries, so much stuff. And you were talking about different angle, right? So how do you take, and I was talking about this to Cassine Gaines, who wrote the E.T. book. Like, how do you take something that has so much stuff already out on it and give it a different spin?
That's a very good question. I should add, before I answer that, I've never met Cassine, but he was very, very helpful via my editor in putting me in touch with Dean Cundy, who obviously shot Jurassic Park, and he was part of his ET book. So if you're listening, Cassine, thank you very much. It was really hard because you're right. There was a book on, as you say, a making of book on Jurassic Park and a making of book on The Lost World by the same author.
Yeah.
And that author worked for Cinefex, which is a sort of special effects driven magazine.
I still have copies of those magazines.
Yeah. And I devoured those books and the articles they wrote. I think the name was Jodie Duncan, if I remember rightly. Forgive me if I'm getting that wrong, but Jodie's articles and books were incredibly useful. I quoted from them within the Jurassic Park book. You'll see, reference numbers to wherever I've, quoted from those books. Jodie had incredible access, back in the day. And you're right, it is difficult to put a new twist on particularly the making of Jurassic Park, which has obviously been covered extensively, and The Lost World, again, because of Jodie's book, was covered extensively. I would say that's why, coming back to when I sort of said to you, well, we'll talk about Jurassic Park 3 later, in a way I had the most fun writing about Jurassic Park 3 because there was much less written about it. And and it was also in a way the most troubled production of the three. So you always get the best stories, and in a way, Joe Johnston, who obviously directed Jurassic Park 3, another fantastically open and honest interviewee. We actually, strangely, you were asking about how I did it, interview-wise. That was all done via email, which is not necessarily, in my past experience, a way I like to do interviews, because you can't really get the back and forth that you want. But he gave some really good answers and then was available for sort of follow-up questions, whenever. So he was incredibly helpful and was very, very open and honest about the Jurassic Park 3 experience. And they, it was a stressful time for him. Of course, they didn't really, the script kept changing and all of that stuff. But so that was where I was able to put more of a personal spin on it, let's say, because there'd been much less written about it. But you're right, you don't want to trot out the same anecdotes that you've read everywhere else. But that was difficult with Jurassic Park because it's been so extensively covered.
Right. We'll talk about Jurassic Park 3 right after this. Joe Johnston, I mean, obviously, you probably have seen The Rocketeer and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and the great films that he did. I just lost my train of thought. But before going to Jurassic Park 3, you spoke to Spielberg, of course.
I did. I had one chat with him, but it was very good. Yeah, well, for the second book, we talked a little bit about Jurassic World right at the end of my interview, but really that's Colin's franchise, if you know what I mean. So I would have obviously loved to have more of a chance to speak to him. He was in the middle of, I think, finishing off West Side Story and starting the Fabelmans film that's coming out soon. To be honest, I think originally I was told I had half an hour, which is, not a huge amount of time to cover so much ground, but he gave a couple of answers. There was one where we were talking about sort of early digital effects, and he gave a really long answer, a really great, brilliant answer. And then he sort of stopped and said, "Oh, well, if I go over the half an hour, we'll just carry on." He wasn't in any way precious with his time. And at that point, I'm thinking, well, how long can I push this interview? So I just carried on as long as I could without, being too cheeky. But his memories, I mean, like my first question was, in the very opening of the Jurassic Park book, there's this sort of great encounter between a young Spielberg who hasn't made a feature at this point, but he's just been hired by Universal. He's about to do a sort of TV pilot, I think. And he's on the back, he's on the back lot being shown, or he's being asked by some Universal people to show a young Michael Crichton around the back lot. And what a chance meeting that those guys have. So I asked him about this, and this is, bear in mind, this is now, I don't know, 50 odd years ago, more than 50 years ago. And of course, he has incredibly crystal clear memories of it, and was able to give me, a great anecdote. And he was like that throughout, really. Just had, his brain operates on a much higher level than mine does. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and one thing I really love, I realize this now, I've realized in the last 10 years. So I used to run this website on DreamWorks and Steven Spielberg. It was very successful. I almost interviewed Spielberg on the set of War of the Worlds once. And I used to crave for this, when DVDs came out, the commentary tracks. I used to crave for a Spielberg film to have a commentary track because it's almost like a university course. And it's never been there. And now I look at it and I see all these books coming out, right? The one that you've written, the one that Cassine has written. And I'm so glad that there was no DVD commentary track, because there's just something about the way the storytelling that you have done, that Cassine has done, other people do. It's just so fantastic that I don't think a commentary track can replace that. Plus you have something physically in your hand. So kudos to that on that. I mean, truly, you actually humanize all these actors / characters in such a way that you completely forget about the film and you start admiring how all that happened, which normally has been a norm in the making of documentaries or whatnot. So fantastic stuff. Jurassic Park 3. What did you learn new about Jurassic Park 3 in terms of production problems it had and script rewrites? Anything that you want to share?
Well, that was really my favorite part of one of the whole parts of the process. There was a website I used a lot called Jurassic Outpost, which had, partly because a lot of the scripts were uploaded on that site. So it was an easy way to comb through all the scripts. Now, one of the things that these books that they like you to do, the same thing was done in the Die Hard book. They like to see the evolution of script to screen, obviously, but in this case, from book to script, to then another draft, to then another draft. So that was easy for, well, I say easy, it was a lot of work, but for Lost World and Jurassic Park, those scripts were online, so you could trace that evolution. With Jurassic Park 3, there were far less scripts available. There's I wanted to know more, but it's easier said than done. I mean, you don't necessarily have the archives thrown open to you, and that's even if the scripts are in Amblin's archives now. They may not be. But there was a lot of chatter online about how speculating what the earlier versions of the Jurassic Park 3 script was. I mean, obviously, in the end, the Sam Neill character, Alan Grant, is sort of hoodwinked into going to Isla Sorna, and to rescue this boy. But there was sort of talk about, originally it was going to be set on over a couple of different islands and things like that, or partly on the sort of mainland, sort of Costa Rica, and but these scripts weren't online, and I don't know how many people have sort of read this stuff. And then I won't say who, but somebody did send me a copy of an earlier draft. So I was like, this is gold dust. As far as I know, fans have not seen this draft. And so I was able to read it, and it was I know it was genuine. And if you read that chapter, it does detail one of the, not all, there were several drafts. So I didn't get hold of the very early ones where there were sort of different crazy ideas that had come up with. But this was the one that was written kind of just before Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor came on board. They were the ones that were sort of rewriting sort of furiously a month before the movie was sort of going into actual, production, into shooting. So this is a sort of the draft before that. And, it is quite different. It's got some elements that you'll recognize. So I was thrilled at getting hold of that and being able to sort of detail that, because as far as I know, that's just not particularly widely known on the internet. But Jurassic fans are like, Sherlock Holmes or something. They don't give up to find out, things. And it's probably some guys out there who have read that script, but certainly I don't think there's an uploaded version online, which is, perhaps how it should be.
Right. But Jurassic Park 3, it had its problems, a lot of them, but I mean, it had its moments, especially the birdcage scene. To me, you said one of the scenes in The Lost World is that whole glass breaking scene. It was very terrifying. And for Jurassic Park 3, that scene, anytime I try to remember Jurassic Park 3, that scene comes to mind, that entire birdcage sequence. And
it's a brilliant sequence, brilliant sequence. I mean, I'd also add that the plane crash is brilliant as well. Just from a technical point of view, it's brilliantly well made. No, I mean, Johnston is a fantastic filmmaker, and he knows how to pull out set pieces. Those two set pieces are brilliant. The Spinosaurus itself, of course, is a pretty cool dinosaur. Yeah. No, there's a lot going for Jurassic Park 3. Their main problem of all problems were they didn't really have an ending, or the ending kind of kept changing and was sort of being rewritten, and the actual ending they've ended up with just isn't that satisfying, to suddenly have this army sweeping in on the beach. It's very, very convenient and doesn't really work.
And I remember watching it in theaters, and that's exactly what I told myself. It was just like out of nowhere. It seemed like they had a longer cut, and because of, studio pressure or because of box office generation, they decided to chop it. But maybe, as you're saying, in the script, it wasn't there either. It was just, that's how it was. Like all of a sudden the army shows up.
I mean, I think you see it in Hollywood productions all the time, where they go into production with a script that isn't really fully finished. And, I think in the case of Jurassic Park 3, they were building elements, they had to build obviously sets and things. So there were certain Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor, when they came on board, they were basically told, right, these scenes are staying because we've already built the sets, the birdcage stuff, for example, or the airplane crash, or the Spinosaurus was being designed and built. So they had to build their story. The sort of character relationships could change a little bit around it. But yeah, the ending was sort of never quite right. And they once you roll into production, you're too busy worrying about what you're shooting that day to think further ahead, and like, oh my God, we've still got an ending to kind of come up with. And yeah, it's a little it's a bit of a shame, but at the same time, I still find it quite an enjoyable Jurassic, in the sense, for the reasons we just said, that there are some great set pieces in it. And who doesn't love seeing Alan Grant come back?
Of course. What did Joe Johnston reveal to you that was surprising, that went into the book as well? That you said he was very upfront and very straightforward. Like, what was something that he spoke to you about that you were taken by and you didn't know before?
Yeah, I think really just his willingness to sort of be honest about the successes and failures of the process of, he's very experienced, as you mentioned, the Rocketeer and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So it certainly wasn't his first film. He'd done Jumanji, of course, which was a big...
Oh, yes, he did Jumanji too, yes.
Visual effects, or, movie of its time. So he certainly wasn't inexperienced, but, he was sort of honest about what it's like to be on set when it's slightly slipping out of your hands, and you're chasing, as I said earlier, you're chasing this sort of ending that isn't really working. And you imagine how stressful that must be.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah, that was the kind of main stuff. I think, we talked about the Spinosaurus. He talked about his relationship with Spielberg. Obviously, he'd gone to Spielberg and said, I think if you want to make, or if you don't want to make the sequel, i.e. The Lost World, I'd be up for it. And then, of course, Spielberg did make The Lost World, and Johnston kind of made his own Lost World with Jumanji in a strange way. And then, not quite, but you know what I mean. And then obviously Spielberg, couldn't think of any, he was the perfect choice for Jurassic Park 3. And they're very, very tight as filmmakers. Obviously, Johnston was working on right back to sort of Raise the Lost Ark, and they've got a long standing relationship.
You said, and we were talking about Jurassic Park 3 ending, and even though I am a huge Spielberg fan, even when it came out, I felt this way. I just felt the last act of The Lost World, Jurassic Park 2, didn't excite me, because to me it kind of became like, and I'm not trying to say that's what the intention was, but personally for me it became like King Kong. You know how you bring King Kong from the island to the city, and even that whole, the way that ending happened, to me it didn't please personally. But was that something that were discussed between you and Spielberg? Like, did you have any reservations about the ending?
I actually didn't mind the ending. I quite like seeing the T-Rex just stomping through San Diego. Right. You've got the great moment with David Koepp, the screenwriter of Jurassic Park, running into it's the sort of bookstore, I think, and just being savaged by the creature. It's a strange, I can see why people don't like it. And of course, originally it didn't exist. There was
that's right,
it was going to be a much longer sequence on the island. And then I think the way Spielberg explained it to me was, well, I sort of decided not to do Jurassic Park 3, but I really wanted to get, I wanted to sort of, ultimately what Colin has done in sort of Dominion, and even Battle of Big Rock, the short that he did, where, and obviously the end of the second half of Fallen Kingdom, where, they're on the mainland. And Spielberg wanted a bit of that mainland fun. So he sort of concertinaed it into this last act, and it was, you can look at the merits and demerits of that, let's say.
I'm just an audience
I kind of enjoyed watching it, the T-Rex stomping down Main Street, bending the traffic lights, stoplights, as you say in America. Drinking from the swimming pool, the dog. There's a lot. The bit with the boy in the house where the swimming pool is brilliant. Not all of that sequence works, I will confess. But I quite enjoy. It was, like you say, very very King Kong, very Godzilla. Perhaps a bit too much, but I still enjoyed it because we'd been on the island for a film and 2/3 by that point. So I guess it was visually different, if nothing else.
It's funny you mentioned that. I had an opposite problem with the Fallen Kingdom, because the first act of Fallen Kingdom was on the island and the rest of it was in the city. And I found that same theory, that the first film was on the island. You have the first act of the second film on the island. It's too long. Let's go to the city. So it was like a complete reversal thing from my point of view. And I'm just strictly speaking as an audience member. I mean, everybody has different opinions and different preferences. But going back to Jurassic Park 3, what I really loved about Jurassic Park 3, aside from the sequences, were its special effects. And I wonder, I mean, obviously Dennis Muren, Stan Winston, Phil Tippett were involved in the film, but Joe Johnston I think he was involved in visual effects in his early part of career too, right? And I wonder if, like, did he talk to you about that too? Because the effects for that, especially the raptors, were just spot on. Like, normally you see that only in a Spielberg film. You don't see that even in a Spielberg produced film. Did he talk to you about that at all? Like the special effects, how much he was involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was intimately involved. You have to be, I think, as a director of those films.
But being a visual effects person, right?
Yeah, but he was inheriting a team, the ILM team, that by this point had been doing it for, in terms of Jurassic dinosaurs, they'd been doing it for sort of 7 or 8 years. They knew what they were doing, and they were always making advances. I mean, that Spinosaurus is just absolutely enormous. I mean, to have that as a sort of part animatronic was just insane, really. But I mean, I think he enjoys working with special effects, and he knew how to utilize them. I mean, as I say, we mentioned the plane crash. I mean, it's that different to the dinosaurs, but that brilliantly done with sort of models and things. And he just knows how to utilize special effects. He knows how to get every inch of what he wants.
Have you seen The Rocketeer?
Yeah, funny enough, I hadn't seen it until I was writing these books. So I did sit down and watch it at some point during. I was still writing, I think, the first one, but I really enjoyed it. Actually, I thought it was very good.
It was a great film, the premise, everything, but the effects. You were talking about early 90s. You see this guy with the rocket pack flying, and it looks pretty good, even for today's time, right? It looks pretty good, and I think that still goes to testament to Joe Johnston, obviously his visual effects team. But if you look at Jumanji, if you look at Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, if you look at Rocketeer, I do, obviously there's a team involved, but I think his heart and soul, being a visual effects person in the past, also transitions and also brings that into his storytelling. Which of the films did you have the most fun writing about? Aside from Jurassic Park 3.
Apart from Jurassic Park 3. Okay, that's a good question. Well, I suppose maybe I'd say Dominion, because it was an unknown quantity for people. So I'm sitting there going, like with all the other with all the other 5 films, there are, like we were saying, books, articles, reviews. So there's a lot to draw on, and there's some stuff out there that's incorrect, particularly on the internet, and there was a lot of rumors and things of scenes in Fallen Kingdom that didn't make it, that supposedly exist or got restricted and things like that. But it was all very difficult to, you had to sort of put your detective hat on and try and speak to people and say, well, look, is this true? I've read this on the internet that this scene existed, and they're like, no, that doesn't exist. But Dominion was, you had sort of more free reign in a way because, well, like I say, there was nothing out there to really base it on, apart from maybe there was a couple of articles from Empire, the British film magazine. They'd had access to Colin. So like when the prologue got released, the 65 million years ago prologue, Empire interviewed Colin. So I was able to look at that. That was quite helpful. But other than that, I was kind of on my own. And it was like, this is quite interesting. Obviously, I hope, you kind of go, God, I hope I haven't got that wrong. People from the franchise looked over the book, so to sort of obviously make sure it's accurate. But yeah, you keep your fingers crossed that you're. But even then, if you're even if you're looking at other people's articles, there's no guarantee they're accurate either. That's the sort of thing you learn in journalism. Mistakes get made and make it into print, and then they become gospel. But Dominion was fascinating. But also because the film was changing. It was obviously now there is this extended edition, which really, I suppose you could say was the original edition, but then bits got cut out, or, they just, they wanted to have a slightly shorter version for the theatrical release, which makes sense financially and ultimately worked for them. Now there's this sort of extended cut. So I was sort of hearing, I knew about the prologue, obviously, because it was online, and then you sort of talk to people about scenes and suddenly they'd go, oh yeah, that's not in the film anymore. And you're like, what? This is before it became public knowledge. So that was quite exciting because you were learning things before it was common news.
Right. Not to cause any, genuinely speaking, I'm not trying to cause any controversy, but when you're making a film, when you're writing a book, there's always a couple of episodes, or maybe even more, where things kind of get annoying in a sense that it's not working out the way it is because schedules, or because maybe just like you're so much deeply involved into it that you're not able to get a bigger picture, the bigger perspective at things. Do you remember anything that you were going to, more of like a personal thing that that you're like, whichever film, that it was like, what the hell am I doing? Like, self-doubt, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely answer that. And so let's say you were asking sort of the schedule of how I interviewed people. When I got Spielberg, who obviously was crucial, particularly to covering the first two movies, that was around November 2020, if I remember correctly. So once you'd done him, then of course you were able to sort of really get going with the writing. And I remember listening to Cassim on your ET interview with him, and he talked about the number of drafts. And I sympathize with him when he answered that question. So, you do your first draft with Spielberg sort of included, and then it goes to the editor, and then it comes back because it's not really working. And then, over that Christmas period that followed, where I was, by that point, I don't know, into the second or third rewrite, that's when you start tearing your hair out that it's not working. And you're not really sure why, because you that old expression, you can't see the wood for the trees, and you're lost inside it at that point.
Yeah.
But then I had a sort of breakthrough, which comes back to your earlier question about who I first spoke to, i.e. Dennis Muren and Phil Tippett, who are obviously huge in the evolution of the visual effects for the film and the sort of physical effects. But then I really started speaking to some of the other guys that worked with Dennis, Mark DePay, for example, Steve Spaz Williams,
right?
And these guys were absolutely crucial in terms of the development of the sort of digital version of the dinosaurs. And I really needed to speak to them, but no one really gives you a list and saying, right, these are the people you need to speak to. You just sort of piece it together yourself, and it ultimately becomes obvious who you need to speak to.
Yeah.
But until you've done that, then the manuscript changed. Once I'd spoken to those guys and was able to get in their side of the story for that first chapter, because that first chapter is obviously the biggest. It's the most important because it's that groundbreaking movie. And then things started to click after that. But that was a tough Christmas, I can tell you that much.
How involved? Well, when Spielberg or Joe Johnston or Colin or anybody else, when they make a film, you screen it, you get feedback. Okay, cut this, cut that. I mean, historically there have been some stories on films like The Time Machine. I don't know if you have seen that with Guy Pearce. It was like a DreamWorks film, and it got cut down by almost 30 minutes, and it didn't really work out. Were there any kind of things that the studio said in terms of draft? Okay, this is not something that we should have in the book ever, or they didn't care?
Yeah, no, they have what's known as the franchise, which obviously is referring to Jurassic. Right. And I don't really know who is on that, committee, let's call it, who or whatever it is, posse of people. Right. I would assume Colin Trevorrow. I think what you have to understand, first of all, is it's pretty much the jewel in Universal's crown, the Jurassic series. Right. And when I was doing these books, they were making the sixth one. So, of course, they're going to be they were less concerned about Jurassic Park, Lost World, Jurassic Park 3, because those movies are out and right. Obviously well loved and everything, but they're of a certain time. Whereas the new franchise was still very much ongoing. So they were more concerned about certain things that were going into, that we wanted, certain people we wanted to speak to, right. That they weren't that keen on. So we didn't speak to them. And there wasn't really that much that they were like, no, you can't go anywhere near this. There were a couple of topics, but which I probably won't mention for diplomatic reasons. But
I don't need to know either, so it's okay.
Yeah, but they weren't. And I have to say, when they looked over the manuscripts for both books, there were small suggestions, but it wasn't anything bad. It wasn't anything like, oh my God, they're cutting that out. There might be the odd line where you're a bit puzzled, but they were pretty reasonable, I thought. It wasn't it was far more strenuous getting the book into a shape that my editor felt would be the right shape to send it to them. And that was his job, because he's worked with studios a lot, and he knows that you need to hand it over in a certain state, not just well written, but with a certain, tone and approach that they will be happy with. So I think he did his job incredibly well. And that's why we went through so many drafts to get it into a good state that the studios would be, or the franchise would be happy with. And yes, they're going to have bits and pieces that they suggest, get changed, but it wasn't anything radical, that's for sure.
I'm glad you mentioned this about having an editor in the same capacity, and I learned this the hard way too. When I made my first film, you submit it to festivals, or you take it to different production companies. And I remember the first time I did that, I didn't even have it color corrected, audio mixed, and I just sent it. And it was a good film, but because they don't have time, they just want to have it just once. And it's a great piece of advice that I wish that writers, including myself, now I know that you can't just rush things and send it to them, because you might just get one shot, and if it's not really done properly, then that's it. It's a big no-no. But I mean, obviously you were commissioned, but nevertheless still makes an impact.
Well, it's also difficult if you're a journalist and you're used to doing things quickly, and you might get an article sent back to you and there might be some minor corrections that you put through. But, the world of journalism is a lot faster than the world of publishing. So you're used to sort of writing quickly, doing the best you can, obviously. But it's a different thing. You're telling it's a very different type of writing to tell one of these kind of long form books.
For sure.
I remember when I did the Dunkirk book, and I handed my first draft in, and I was quite happy with myself, quite pleased. And then the editor said, well, I'll send it back, with corrections or suggestions, whatever the word he used. And I was thinking to myself, well, of course there won't be anything, and how wrong I was. But you look at it, it's tunnel vision when you're doing it yourself. You think what you're writing. And also, I mean, one of the real learning curves on these books, on all of them, is writing about visual effects and special effects, trying to explain them to the reader, to the layman, when realistically I'm a layman too. I don't have a huge background in special effects. So you're talking to these absolute geniuses, and they will talk to you on their level, and it's up to you to try and break that down and convey it to the reader so it's understandable. It's like, okay, so how did you, how did they sort of do the skin for the T-Rex or something? And they'll tell you complicated, processes that they went through. And you just have to try and convey that in a sort of reader-friendly way. And that's a lot of the stuff that gets rewritten is just to try and make it reader-friendly.
And I'm glad you talked about tunnel vision. I do think we all fall into that trap where, I did a great job. How bad can it be? And then you get notes and you're like, oh crap, I need to get out of that tunnel vision. After you interviewed Spielberg, did it become, I know you had like studio, obviously, licensing the book, and you had a publisher. Did it become easier to get other people quicker?
Yeah, well, I think what the big help was Universal gave us a letter which we were able to send to publicists and agents and what have you. And that letter sort of said, this is an official, Universal and Amblin approved project. We'd love you to be a part of it if you like. Don't feel obliged, but we'd love you to be a part of it. And there were only a handful of people that didn't either respond or they were too busy. I mentioned sort of 100 people. There were a few I just couldn't get hold of. Maybe because, for example, you would start by going on the IMDb Pro and looking up people's sort of agent and publicist details. And I would have loved to have spoken to BD Wong, who plays Dr. Henry Wu. I tried getting him on Instagram. But he probably gets like 1 million people contacting him on Instagram all the time. I got no response from his team, which again, it could be outdated details. You just don't know. And that was a shame, because he would have been great, because he's such a presence through the films. It wasn't to be. But then, and I know Cassim mentioned this in his ET book, there's a lot of material out there already. There were some BD Wong interviews online, so you just end up quoting from those. That's not as satisfactory, obviously, as speaking to him yourself. But you have to accept, given the time limits, you're not going to get everybody. But of course, when you've got Spielberg on board and Colin Trevorrow, it makes life a lot easier. Like, as an example, Bryce Dallas Howard, who did her interview while she was shooting Dominion. I mean, obviously she had a day off or an afternoon off when she did it, but was so good. I literally remember saying to her at the end, well, you just made this book 10% better, basically, by that interview. And she just gave so much. As you mentioned, she did one of the introductions. I mean, she's heavily invested in that franchise. I mean, you may have noticed when Dominion was coming out, she probably more than any other actor on it was doing so much publicity. I think because she just loves those movies and she loves the fan base.
Well, it was in the foreword of the book where she was, I think she's kind of around our age, maybe younger.
She's definitely younger than me.
Yeah, definitely younger. I should say that, definitely younger than us. But that when you grow up with a film like that, like when you grow up with E.T., it just becomes your world. I mean, that's how she was introduced. So when I read that the foreword by her, I could feel her love for these films, because you can just tell, when somebody's talking about something and you feel passionate about, It's pretty obvious. And that was going to be my next question. I guess you probably already answered it. Who was, without anybody making an exception, who was the most fun to talk to? And
Oh, that's a very good question. Well,
you can
I'm
define fun in any way you want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, the one interview, and Kassim mentioned this too, and as soon as he mentioned it, I was like, "Yep, I agree with you on that one." We both got to speak to John Williams, and it was one of the shortest interviews I did. It was quite interesting because John is a legend. I will undoubtedly never get the chance to speak to him again, I would imagine. And you just in the presence of greatness, let's say. I mean, Spielberg I had interviewed a few times before for other, just on sort of for press junkets and things. I mean, the Warhorse and the Post I'd spoken to him for.
Right.
So, and I remember being very nervous. Well, not so much for Warhorse, but the BFG in Cannes, when he had that in Cannes.
Yeah.
I remember I had a sort of 2-on-1 with him and the young girl who was in the BFG. And I remember being strangely nervous before that, which is odd because I do this kind of thing all the time. So you don't normally get that nervous, but and he of course was lovely. But so I guess having done him already, I was more nervous just that went right, that I got the material I needed. But John Williams, it was just like, well, this is a man whose music you've heard your entire life. And also I kind of get excited about speaking to musicians anyway, because it's not something I tend to do that often. So he was great. He couldn't remember very much about the Lost World score, which was quite amusing. He'd re-listened to the Jurassic score quite recently, or when I spoke to him, because sort of him and Spielberg had kind of gone back over Jurassic for a technical reason. So that was relatively fresh, and of course that's got to be one of his top 3 scores, right? Jurassic Park.
Yeah, Jurassic Park, E.T., Star Wars. I mean, there's more, but
yeah, there's probably more. It's pretty mean to try and fit them all into 3.
Home Alone.
Home Alone. There you go.
One of his best. That's one of his best.
So he was great. Wow, fun. I love Dean Cundy, actually. He was great. I never got to speak to Janusz Kaminski, who obviously shot The Lost World. That would have been amazing.
That would have been amazing.
A difficult one to get hold of. Probably working, I would imagine. But Dean was great. All the cinematographers were brilliant. John Schwartzman, who shot Jurassic World and Dominion. I had a long time with him. I actually went back to write a piece for this magazine called British Cinematographer, which I'd never written for before, where I said to the editor, I spoke to John for Dominion. I can probably get him again. So I did another interview with him, for just sort of Dominion focused. And he's wonderful. I mean, he worked with Michael Bay on things like Pearl Harbor, and hugely experienced cinematographer. Does a lot for John Lee Hancock as well. So yeah, he was brilliant. I mean, he's like a old school cinematographer. I mean, he's just right at the top of his game. So he was fun. As I mentioned earlier, Rick Carter was great. Such a nice guy. So yeah, there were a lot. I mean, I'm trying to think of some actors that were. Well, Laura Dern is just a brilliant interview. Sam Neill was like, I mean, all the main cast were great. They all gave their time, and that I was quite pleased that I managed to get. Well, if you look at the Dominion cast where they're all reassembled, let's say, I got all of those main ones. Chris Pratt, Bryce, as I mentioned, the original 3. So they were all. Again, it wasn't down to me. It was down to the franchise and the fact that they all love it. It's been a huge part of their lives.
100%. And when in any book that you write, but specifically, let's say the Jurassic Park books, the Jurassic World book, when it's done and dusted, and when you've given it to the publisher, right? Like it's approved, everything is good. The process of getting the visuals, like the cover, the layout and all that, Does that start when you are almost done writing the book, or is it after? And how much involvement do you have in it, or do you even get to see any of that?
I have limited involvement, I would say. I write the captions, so those captions were all mine. I mean, again, in collaboration with the editor.
Sure.
But it's really him that's tasked with sort of assembling the visuals, you know, with the designer obviously working out the cover. And that's it's a slow process to go through the archives and get what you can get. You know, sometimes we went to people like John Bell, for example, who, you know, one of the art directors who did a lot of work. You know, all these guys have got their own personal archives, and we were able to sort of ask them for stuff. Dave Lowry, another one that sort of did a lot of the storyboards, and they're often the best things. You know, of course, you want to see some nice glossy stills from the movie in there, especially if they're ones you've not seen. You know, I mean, for example, for Dominion, that I think it was one of the first pictures that was released of Chris Pratt on the motorbike when he's being chased by the raptors in Malta. I really like that. It's a cool image, but it's been everywhere. I mean, that image was in all the magazines and newspapers because it was kind of the first one released. So the idea is really to find stuff that's different, you know, even if it's an artist's rendering of that image, let's say of the motorbike chase or something. But yeah, I didn't have a huge amount to do unless it was hooking up my editor with certain people who had artwork themselves. I mean, the costume designers, that kind of thing.
I can imagine when you're probably doing your first book, not these ones, but first book, not being involved in that process intensively is probably painful, because, you know, you've written this thing and that's the way it is, but you want to be involved. But by now, is it like a blessing that once you're done with the writing, you prefer to be surprised? Or?
Well, there's definitely the fun bit is when you get the layout through. So your text has been designed and added, and then all the photos because obviously the editor has to read the text and illustrate each page with suitable images. You might have some wonderful images, but if they don't relate to what I've got in the text, then they might be a bit redundant. I mean, you'll probably end up, if they're that amazing, they'll probably end up somewhere. But you know, each illustration, each photo, each drawing, each piece of concept art, it has to relate to what's on the page. So the fun bit is getting through images I mean, certainly for the case of Dunkirk and Tenet, where, you know, no one had really seen much of those films apart from maybe one trailer. So suddenly all this stuff that I've been hearing about from various people, where they're describing like the turnstiles that are in Tenet, those sort of machines that send people back in time. I'd sort of visualized them in my head, but had no real idea what they looked like until I saw the layout and could see, oh, right, that's what they look like. And that actually means you could then slightly change bits of text, because you could sort of just, you know, you just think, right, that's what it looks like. And it clarified things in your head. So in the case of Jurassic, of course, I'd seen virtually nothing of Dominion, visually speaking, apart from obviously that prologue. So when you're suddenly able to, I'd had the script, as I mentioned, but when you're suddenly able to sort of put things in context and go, oh my God, that's what it looks like. I remember, this is the strange thing about doing these books, when I finally saw Dominion, only really about 3 days before it came out, just at the main press screening in London, I found myself, obviously I knew the story, so that was strange. In terms of the film experience, I knew what was coming around each corner, let's say. Right. I still enjoyed the sort of rattling pace that it had. But I found myself looking at the strangest things. So, for example, when they're in the Hyperloop thing, which is that sort of underground shuttle that is in the Biosyn grounds, and it's sort of underneath the earth. So it links all these research stations. So it's this sort of like a metro station kind of thing that they're in. So I think it's Sam Neill and Laura Dern and the young girl Isabella Sermon. They're all sitting in this pod thing, and it's supposed to be simulating kind of movement. It's shuffling them from one part to the other, and I found myself I should have been concentrating on what they were saying, because obviously that's the scene, but John Schwartzman told me how they simulated the idea of movement by just having kind of pulsating lights go on, flick on and off. So it looks like it's a tube, a little metro train that's moving past, and you see the flashing lights and everything. But of course they were sort of still, but they were just, it was a trick of the eye. It was a bit of movie magic, basically. So I found myself looking at strange things like that. But that's the nature of when you've got so deep into something that you're just looking at really bizarre corners of the screen.
That's kind of like the story of Henry Thomas that Cassine and I talked about. Do you know about that, the E.T. story?
Remind me.
When E.T. had its premiere, I don't know if it was premiere, but it was the first time showing at Arizona. And when the film was over, Henry Thomas was there, Drew Barrymore, Spielberg, and Henry Thomas came to Spielberg and he said, "You ruined the movie for me," because he kept hearing while he was watching the movie, "Cut, okay, Henry, do it that way," because he lived that on-set experience so much that he didn't enjoy the film as an audience member at all. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying, right?
Yeah, it's funny actually. I've just got hold of the extended edition of Jurassic World Dominion, and I'm going to sit and watch it in the next couple of days actually, because I want to enjoy it now away from even then. I mean, I can't exactly remember when I finished the book. I think it was around April, and so I then had a couple of months, and then the movie was actually coming out, and I did do some press interviews for the movie, which was a bit strange. It was like, oh yeah, right, I know exactly what this film's about. Yeah, so it was odd to then come back to it with a sort of journalist head on, and then you're like I said, it got these sort of really nasty reviews, certainly in the UK. I don't know about elsewhere, but the reviews weren't great. And I was kind of like, what, were we watching the same film? This film is absolutely not as bad as you're saying. And so now I kind of want to watch it away from all of that and just assess it, on its own. Obviously the full version that Colin intended as well. But yeah, it's a strange thing when you've been through that process and then you finally see the film. It's an odd experience. I had the same thing with Dunkirk and Tenet. It's, so much about something before the world's media have seen it, and it's a very strange feeling.
You will like extended edition of Jurassic World Dominion. I certainly didn't think it was as bad as the reviews were. I
think most Jurassic fans don't. I think in the end, it was a classic example of critics versus audience. I mean, I would assume that the $1 billion that they took was partly repeat business. I think that people went back and rewatched it, and most fans I've spoken to have liked it, and they've yes, they accept it's not the original movie. Like I said earlier, the bar was set so high. You're not gonna that's a lightning in a bottle moment.
But I think for me personally, one of the things that I wasn't, I mean, it's not something that I'm gonna say, oh, the movie sucks because of that, but it was the middle part where they go for where the dinosaurs have this the smuggling thing and all that stuff. I thought that wasn't really developed. But having said that, overall, it was such a engaging film, especially the whole sequence in Malta, when the chase happened and all that stuff, and even the finale. And I really liked the science behind it. Like, I was so glad that they had the science that they had in the first film, in the first half. They had that in the last half of this film, which I thought was really cool.
I also loved the fact that they brought Lewis Dodgson back, who is always one of my favorite characters from the books. Obviously, he's somewhat different here. I mean, in the books, he was not the head of Biosyn, and he was kind of sociopath, really. But
Well,
yeah, I loved him here. He's a sort of, this sort of Steve Jobsian type figure. Campbell Scott is also one of my favorite actors. You were asking about people that are fun to interview. Campbell Scott, purely because I love him. I love his work, and I was so happy he was in the film and that he was playing Dodgson. So yeah, I was really pleased to see him in it.
It's funny you mentioned Steve Jobs. When I was watching the movie with my son, he's only 12. He elbowed me. He goes, "That looks like Tim Cook." And I was like, actually, he does. I wonder if it was an accidental thing or what happened. But going back to your book, just one last couple of things. When you saw the actual book, right? I mean, here it is. What did you feel? Like when you actually saw this thing in its entirety?
It's very strange because if I'm being totally honest, I haven't massively looked through it because it's like, I'll tell you what I did look at, and which is one thing, people on Amazon and so forth who sort of review it, they all seem to be really enamored by this. And this is very much a trait of all of these ultimate visual history books, are the sort of pull out little gimmicks. Everyone loves those. You had them in the Die Hard one as well. I think that was an idea of my editor who created this series. And, it's a brilliant idea. And of course, I hadn't really seen those. I think I might be wrong about this, but because you get on certain pages where those inserts are placed, there are captions, I think, for those inserts, but I don't think I wrote those insert captions. So they were all fairly new to me. I was only very dimly aware of what those were going to be. And like everyone else, I'm a big fan of those. I mean, I had zero to do with those, but it's weird because, you have been through the entire layout, so it inch by inch. So to then sit and look at the book, it's a strange thing. It's probably like a filmmaker not going back to watch his movie once he's made it.
Oh God, yeah.
And it's that sort of a thing. But I mean, in all the cases for all those insight books that I've done, they're beautifully designed, beautifully put together. I think they're well worth the money, to be honest, because they are genuinely lavish. It's like, never mind that I've written them, it's got nothing to do with me. They're just really well. I haven't actually seen the ET one yet. I really want to see it. I imagine that's great.
It's great. I honestly read both of these books very quickly, aside from the fact that whenever I didn't have time, I would split them into certain chapters. And even though I knew a lot of stuff, it was just, like I said earlier, there was just something, the way it's told, it's like watching a movie, right? Like you're feeling these actors as human beings as opposed to just being actors.
You can sit down with your son and watch all 6 back to back now.
Thank you for your time. You're having yourself a great evening. I know it's late there, so thank you for staying up.
Pleasure. No worries. Thanks so much for speaking to me. Cheers. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.